Paige's seemingly perfect life shatters when she discovers her husband, Eric, is having an affair with his manipulative coworker, Vanessa. As Paige confronts the betrayal, she's thrust into a whirlwind of lies, deceit, and shocking revelations that test her trust and resilience. With Vanessa's schemes escalating and Eric's secrets unraveling, Paige is forced to fight for the truth while navigating the emotional turmoil of infidelity and deception. The story grips viewers with its explosive confrontations, moral dilemmas, and the devastating consequences of betrayal, leaving audiences questioning loyalty, justice, and redemption. Welcome back, and thank you for tuning in. We're diving into another jaw-dropping story today, one that will leave you questioning everything about loyalty, trust, and betrayal. Let's get started. The morning sun painted the small suburban neighborhood in soft gold as Paige Reynolds finished arranging fresh lilies in a glass vase. Her kitchen, pristine and modern, reflected the life she and her husband, Eric, had built together. A life filled with quiet routines, dinner parties, and plans for the future. Paige adjusted the flowers one last time, admiring how the light danced off the polished granite countertops. It was her ritual, a small act that made the house feel like home. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect scene, something was stirring, something she couldn't quite name yet. Eric walked in, already dressed for work. His sharp suit and neatly knotted tie fit him like armor, projecting confidence and control. He kissed Paige's cheek without breaking stride, grabbing his coffee from the counter. "Big day at the office?" Paige asked, trying to sound casual. "Always," Eric replied, his voice clipped. "We're closing the Whitman deal today. Should be a win for the firm." Paige smiled, though something about his tone felt off, rushed, almost distracted. She brushed the thought aside, convincing herself it was just work stress. Eric had always been the driven one, the man who thrived on deadlines and late nights at the office. It was one of the things that had attracted her to him in the first place. Back then, she saw it as ambition. Now, it sometimes felt like distance. As Eric disappeared out the door, Paige's phone buzzed. A text from her best friend, Natalie. "Natalie, brunch this weekend. I need details about Eric's office party." Paige hesitated before responding. The office party, the one Eric had insisted she skip, because it was mostly business. She told herself it made sense. These corporate events could be exhausting. Still, a flicker of doubt lingered. Shaking it off, Paige typed a quick reply and moved on with her morning. Later that afternoon, Paige dropped by Natalie's place, a cozy bungalow that always smelled like vanilla candles. Natalie greeted her with a hug and an oversized mug of coffee. "So what's new with Mr. Perfect?" Natalie teased, settling into the couch. Paige laughed, but it sounded forced. "Busy as ever, the Whitman deal's got him running ragged." Natalie said, raising an eyebrow. "And you're sure it's just the deal keeping him busy?" Paige froze. "What's that supposed to mean?" Natalie shrugged. "I don't know, Paige. You skipped the party, and Eric's been working late a lot lately. Don't tell me it hasn't crossed your mind." "It hasn't," Paige said quickly. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. Natalie leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Look, I'm not trying to stir up trouble, but I've seen this before. You just need to keep your eyes open." Paige brushed it off, but her friend's words stuck with her. That evening, as Eric came home later than usual, Paige studied him more closely, the way he avoided eye contact, the quick kiss that felt more like habit than affection. She reminded herself that marriages went through phases, busy periods, stress. None of it meant anything. At least, that's what she told herself as she drifted off to sleep. The following week, Paige decided to surprise Eric at work with lunch, a sweet gesture to reconnect after a string of busy days. She packed his favorite chicken salad sandwich and drove to his office downtown. The receptionist greeted her warmly, but looked hesitant when Paige mentioned dropping off lunch. "He's in a meeting," she said. "Do you want to leave it with me?" Paige hesitated. "Actually, I'll just wait. It won't take long, right?" Sure." Minutes turned into nearly an hour. Paige finally stood to leave when the elevator chimed, and Eric stepped out, laughing with a woman Paige didn't recognize. The woman was tall, polished, and wore a pencil skirt that hugged her curves. Her hand lingered a little too long on Eric's arm as she spoke, and Paige felt her stomach twist. Eric spotted her then, his smile faltering for just a moment before he recovered. "Paige, what are you doing here?" "I thought I'd bring you lunch." She held up the bag, suddenly feeling foolish. Eric glanced at the woman before stepping toward Paige. "Thanks, babe. That's really thoughtful, but I can't eat right now. We're swamped." "I'll just leave it in your office," Paige said, her voice too light. The woman smiled, polite, but with a hint of something Paige couldn't quite place. "Paige, this is Vanessa. She's new to the team, helping with the Whitman deal." Vanessa extended a perfectly manicured hand. "Nice to meet you. Eric's told me so much about you." The words felt rehearsed. Paige shook her hand, then turned back to Eric. "I'll get out of your way. Just don't forget to eat." She managed a smile as she walked out, but her thoughts churned. Paige tried to brush it off. Vanessa could be just a colleague, friendly, attractive, but harmless. Still, her instincts wouldn't let it go. Later that night, while Eric showered, Paige did something she'd never done before. She picked up his phone. No password. She felt a pang of guilt as she scrolled through his messages. Most were work-related, but then she found them. Texts from Vanessa. "Vanessa, tonight was amazing. I can't stop thinking about it." Paige's breath caught. Her hand shook as she kept scrolling. "Eric, you're impossible to resist, but we need to be careful." The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. Paige's world tilted. The carefully constructed life she'd built with Eric cracking apart piece by piece. She set the phone down as she heard the water shut off. When Eric emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist, Paige sat frozen on the bed. "Everything okay?" he asked, drying his hair. Paige opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she stood and walked out of the room, leaving Eric to stare after her. Her mind raced. Was this the first time? How long had it been going on? And more importantly, what was she going to do next? Paige sat in the dimly lit living room, her mind racing as the faint hum of the television filled the silence. The words on Eric's phone replayed in her head, each one cutting deeper than the last. She gripped a throw pillow, pressing it tightly against her stomach, as if it could stop the sick feeling swirling inside her. She wanted answers. She deserved them. But the thought of confronting Eric left her frozen, trapped somewhere between rage and fear. The sound of footsteps snapped her out of her spiral. Eric stood at the doorway, freshly showered, with a towel slung over his shoulder. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, leaning casually against the frame. Paige's eyes flicked to him, her voice sharp. "And you've been busy." Eric's brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" She stood, her heart pounding. "Vanessa, how long has it been going on?" His face paled for just a second, a flicker so fast she almost missed it, but it was there. And it was enough. "Paige, you're overreacting. Vanessa's just a coworker." "Don't," she cut him off. "I saw the messages. Eric, don't insult me by lying." For the first time, Eric looked panicked. He stepped toward her, his hands out like he could calm her down. Okay, I'll explain. Just listen." "No," Paige's voice cracked. "You don't get to explain this away. I trusted you, Eric. I trusted you with everything." His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he didn't look like the polished, confident man he always pretended to be. He looked small, weak. "I made a mistake," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Paige let out a bitter laugh. "A mistake? That's what you call it? Is that what Vanessa is? A mistake?" He didn't answer, and the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Paige's chest heaved as the weight of it all crashed over her. She grabbed her purse and keys, pushing past him toward the door. "Paige, wait, where are you going?" "I don't know," she said, not even looking back. "Anywhere but here." She drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring past her as she replayed the night in her head. She knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Paige woke up in Natalie's guest room, surrounded by crumpled tissues and the faint smell of lavender. Natalie peeked in, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You look like hell," she said, setting the mugs down. "Thanks," Paige muttered, sitting up and pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Natalie sat beside her. "So, what now?" "I don't know," Paige admitted. "I don't even know where to start." You start by figuring out what you want, Natalie said. Do you want to fix this, or do you want out? Paige stared down at her coffee, the steam swirling like her thoughts. What if I don't know what I want? Natalie took a sip and shrugged. Then you figure it out, but you don't have to do it alone. Paige spent the rest of the day in a haze, torn between anger and heartbreak. She ignored Eric's texts and calls, unsure whether she was ready to hear whatever excuses he had prepared. By the time she returned home, it was dark, and the house felt emptier than ever. She wandered through the rooms, each one filled with memories she couldn't escape. On the nightstand, her wedding photo stared back at her, smiling faces frozen in time, oblivious to the cracks that would one day shatter everything. She turned it face down. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between them grew wider. Eric tried to fix things, promising it was over, that Vanessa meant nothing. But Paige wasn't convinced. The lies had already taken root, poisoning every conversation, every touch. She started to notice things she'd ignored before. Late nights, hushed phone calls, unexplained expenses. And then there was Vanessa. Paige couldn't get her out of her head. The way she smiled, the way Eric looked at her. She needed to know the truth. So one afternoon, she followed him. Her heart pounded as she trailed Eric's car through the city, her palms slick against the steering wheel. She told herself it wasn't crazy. It was necessary. When he pulled into a restaurant parking lot, her stomach dropped. Vanessa was already there, waiting for him. Paige watched as Eric leaned in, placing a hand on Vanessa's lower back, guiding her inside. Her vision blurred, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not now. Instead, she grabbed her phone and took pictures, proof of what she already knew, but couldn't bring herself to fully accept. Later that night, Paige confronted him. I saw you, she said, her voice trembling. With her. Eric didn't even bother denying it this time. I'm sorry, he said, but the words felt hollow. No, Paige snapped. You don't get to apologize, not after this. For the first time, she felt something shift. She wasn't sad anymore. She was angry. And anger felt better than heartbreak. Paige began preparing for what came next. She met with a lawyer, started looking for apartments, and even opened a separate bank account. Eric tried to win her back, sending flowers and leaving voicemails filled with promises to change. But Paige had heard enough promises to last a lifetime. Natalie stood by her side through it all, reminding her she deserved better. You're stronger than you think, Natalie said one night, pouring Paige another glass of wine. I don't feel strong, Paige admitted, but you are. Look at everything you've been through, and you're still standing. Paige let the words sink in. Maybe Natalie was right. Maybe she was stronger than she gave herself credit for. As she packed up the last box, ready to leave the house she'd once called home, Paige felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was done living in Eric's shadow. If you're still here, drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts so far. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Paige stared at the cardboard boxes stacked by the door, each one filled with pieces of the life she was about to leave behind. Her wedding photo, now shoved into the bottom of a box, felt heavier than all the others combined. Eric was still at work, or so he claimed, and she planned to be gone before he returned. But as she reached for the last box, her phone buzzed. Eric, we need to talk, I'm coming home. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't ready for this. Not another argument, not more lies. But before she could decide whether to leave or stay, the front door opened. Eric stepped inside, looking disheveled and tense. His tie was loose, and the shadows under his eyes made him look older. You're leaving? He asked, his eyes darting to the boxes. Paige crossed her arms. What did you expect? Paige, don't do this. His voice cracked, and for the first time, he looked genuinely scared. We can fix this. She shook her head. We can't fix something that was built on lies, and I won't stay with someone who doesn't respect me. His jaw tightened. You think this is easy for me? I made a mistake. Stop calling it that, Paige snapped. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill or losing your keys. This was a choice repeatedly. Eric stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're right, I messed up, but I love you, Doesn't that count for something? For a moment, Paige hesitated. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that the man she married was still in there somewhere. But then she thought about the texts, the lies, and the way Vanessa's hand lingered on his arm. "It's too late, Eric," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His face fell, but he didn't fight her this time. Instead, he sank onto the couch, burying his head in his hands. Paige didn't wait for him to speak again. She grabbed the last box and walked out the door, leaving him behind. Paige moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with mismatched furniture, but it felt like hers. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was living in someone else's shadow. She threw herself into work, taking on extra shifts and volunteering at a local shelter, anything to keep her mind busy. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Eric wasn't done with her. Her suspicions were confirmed when she found him waiting outside her building one night. "Eric, what are you doing here?" He looked desperate, his hair unkempt and his shirt wrinkled. "I need to talk to you." Paige hesitated. "About what?" "It's Vanessa," he said, running a hand through his hair. "She's not who I thought she was." Paige crossed her arms. "I'm not interested in your relationship drama, Eric." "No, you don't understand." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "She's been blackmailing me." Paige blinked. "What?" Eric exhaled sharply. "It started after the affair. She threatened to go public unless I paid her off. I tried to end it, but she wouldn't let me. I didn't know what else to do." Paige's heart pounded. She wanted to walk away, to leave him to deal with the mess he created, but something about the fear in his voice stopped her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need your help." Paige stared at him, torn between anger and pity. "Why should I help you?" "Because she's not just after me. She knows about you too." The next day, Paige met Natalie at their usual coffee shop and told her everything. "She's blackmailing him?" Natalie's eyes widened. "Paige, this sounds dangerous." "I know." Paige stirred her coffee, her hands trembling. "But what if she's telling the truth? What if she goes after me next?" Natalie leaned in. "You need to be careful. Don't let him drag you back into his mess." Paige nodded, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Determined to take control, Paige decided to confront Vanessa herself. She showed up at her office unannounced, catching her just as she was leaving for lunch. "Paige?" Vanessa's eyes widened in surprise. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk." Vanessa smirked. "About what?" "You know exactly what." Vanessa's expression shifted, her smirk fading. "Fine, but not here." They ended up at a quiet cafe down the street. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, looking completely unfazed. "I assume Eric told you everything?" "He told me enough." Vanessa shrugged. "Then you know it's too late to stop this." Paige narrowed her eyes. "You're not going to get away with this." Vanessa leaned forward, her smile sharp. "Who's going to stop me, Eric? He's pathetic. And you're just the discarded wife trying to clean up his mess." Paige's hands clenched under the table. "We'll see about that." Paige left the cafe shaken, but more determined than ever. She reached out to a lawyer and started gathering evidence, bank statements, emails, anything that could prove Vanessa's manipulation. Meanwhile, Eric's desperation grew. He began showing up at her apartment more often, begging for forgiveness and offering to help bring Vanessa down. Paige wasn't sure if she could trust him, but for now, they had a common enemy. As they pieced together their case, Paige began to see a different side of Eric. He wasn't the untouchable, confident man she once admired. He was flawed, broken even. And for the first time, she saw her own strength in contrast. The final confrontation came 2 weeks later, when Paige and Eric confronted Vanessa at a charity gala. They knew she wouldn't expect them to show up together, and they used it to their advantage. Paige approached Vanessa first, keeping her voice steady. "Enjoying the party?" Vanessa turned, her smile faltering. "Paige, I didn't think you'd be here." "Surprise," Paige said, stepping closer. "I wanted to see the woman who thought she could tear my life apart and get away with it." Vanessa's eyes darted to Eric, who stood just behind Paige. "You can't touch me," Vanessa said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her voice. Paige pulled out her phone and showed Vanessa the evidence they had collected. Emails, texts, and even recordings of her threats. You sure about that? Vanessa's face drained of color. Eric stepped forward. This ends tonight. Before Vanessa could respond, security approached, alerted by Paige earlier. Within minutes, Vanessa was escorted out, her carefully curated reputation in ruins. Eric turned to Paige. I couldn't have done this without you. Paige looked at him, her expression unreadable. I didn't do it for you. She walked away, leaving him to deal with the aftermath. Paige's story didn't end there. She moved forward, stronger than before. She found a new job, reconnected with friends, and even started dating again. As for Eric, he spent months rebuilding his career and his reputation. He reached out to Paige a few times, hoping for another chance, but she had already closed that chapter of her life. Vanessa, on the other hand, faced legal charges and public humiliation. Her downfall was swift, a reminder that actions have consequences. And Paige. She learned that sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most freedom. If you're still here, drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts so far. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories, just like this one. Paige sat in her car outside the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Today was the day everything came to a head. Vanessa had refused to back down after the gala, and instead of retreating, she doubled down, filing a defamation lawsuit against Paige and Eric. It was a desperate move, but it was enough to keep Paige's anxiety simmering just beneath the surface. Eric sat in the passenger seat, dressed in a suit, but looking like he hadn't slept in days. His jaw was tense, and he kept fidgeting with the cuffs of his shirt. You ready for this? He asked, his voice low. Paige didn't look at him. I don't have a choice, do I? He nodded, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. They were both walking into a battle. But for Paige, this wasn't just about Vanessa. It was about reclaiming her life. Inside the courthouse, the air felt heavy. Paige spotted Vanessa near the front, her sharp red dress practically daring someone to challenge her. She looked confident, but Paige saw the cracks beneath the surface, the nervous tapping of her nails and the way her eyes darted around the room. Their lawyer, Mia, leaned over to whisper, She's rattled. Stay calm, and let me handle the rest. Paige nodded, but her pulse was racing. When the hearing began, Vanessa's attorney tried to paint Paige as a jealous, scorned wife who had launched a smear campaign out of spite. She has no evidence of these alleged threats, he argued. This is nothing more than an attempt to damage my client's career and reputation. Paige's lawyer stood confidently. Actually, we have plenty of evidence. She laid out screenshots of text messages, emails, and bank statements that traced Vanessa's attempts to extort Eric. The courtroom was silent as each piece of evidence was displayed. Paige watched as Vanessa's expression shifted from smug to panicked. Eric leaned in and whispered, She's sweating. Vanessa's lawyer tried to recover, questioning the authenticity of the messages, but then Mia dropped the bombshell, a recorded phone call between Eric and Vanessa, where Vanessa admitted to blackmailing him. The sound of Vanessa's voice filled the courtroom, her words dripping with malice. You think you can get rid of me that easily? If you don't pay, I'll ruin you. And your wife. Vanessa's face drained of color. Paige's heart pounded as the judge called for a brief recess. She stepped into the hallway, where Vanessa was already pacing. You think this is over? Vanessa hissed, her voice low but venomous. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Paige squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. Neither do you. Eric stepped between them. Walk away, Vanessa. It's done. Vanessa's eyes flickered with desperation, but she turned and stalked off, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Back inside, the judge ruled in Paige and Eric's favor, dismissing Vanessa's claims and opening the door for countercharges. Relief washed over Paige, but it was quickly overshadowed by exhaustion. She wasn't naive. Vanessa wouldn't go down without a fight. As they left the courthouse, Eric turned to her. We make a good team, he said. Paige met his eyes, but there was no warmth in her voice. This doesn't change anything. Eric flinched but nodded. I get it, but thank you, for everything. She walked away without answering. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal paperwork, media coverage, and endless questions. Vanessa's downfall was public and messy, and Paige couldn't escape the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Natalie was a constant source of support, reminding Paige that she'd done the right thing. "You stood up for yourself," Natalie said. "Don't let anyone make you feel bad about that." But Paige still struggled to shake the feeling that her life had become a cautionary tale. One night, she found herself scrolling through old photos, vacations, anniversaries, birthdays. Each image felt like a lie. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. It was Eric. "I didn't think you'd come back," Paige said, stepping aside to let him in. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his voice soft. Paige crossed her arms. "Why?" "Because I care," he said, "and because I still love you." Paige's throat tightened, but she shook her head. "You don't get to say that. Not after everything." "I know," Eric said. "But I need you to know that I'm trying. I've been in therapy, and I'm working on myself. I'm not asking you to forgive me. Not yet. I just don't want to lose you completely." Paige's resolve wavered, but she forced herself to stay strong. "You already lost me, Eric." He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "I'll respect that, but if you ever change your mind—" Paige didn't respond. She closed the door behind him, her heart heavy but certain. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding. Paige focused on her career, her friendships, and most importantly, herself. Vanessa's case unraveled further, exposing more lies and financial schemes. Eventually, she faced criminal charges, and Paige finally felt like she could breathe again. Eric stayed in therapy, and though he reached out occasionally, Paige kept her distance. One day, she received an envelope in the mail. It was from Eric, divorce papers, signed and finalized. There was no letter, no note, just closure. Paige set the papers aside and looked around her apartment. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. If you've made it this far, let us know what you think about Paige's story in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Paige leaned against the kitchen counter, her phone buzzing with notifications. News of Vanessa's criminal charges had spread like wildfire, turning her into a public spectacle overnight. Social media was flooded with headlines about her schemes, but Paige wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Despite everything that had unraveled, Paige couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. She checked her locks twice before bed, flinched at every unknown number that called, and kept glancing over her shoulder in crowded places. Natalie had tried to reassure her. "Vanessa's facing real consequences. She's not going to come after you," she'd said. But Paige wasn't so sure. Her instincts were right. The uneasy calm shattered 2 nights later, when Paige arrived home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Her breath hitched. She'd double-checked the locks. She was sure of it. Heart pounding, she stepped inside and immediately froze. The living room was trashed. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers left wide open. Someone had been there, and whoever it was, they weren't looking for loose change. Paige's hand trembled as she dialed 911. The police arrived within minutes, sweeping the apartment and confirming that whoever had broken in was already gone. "It looks like someone was searching for documents," the officer said, motioning to the mess. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Paige swallowed hard. "Vanessa." The officer took notes. "We'll need a formal statement and a list of anything that might be missing." Paige nodded, but her mind was racing. She didn't need to check to know what Vanessa had been after. The evidence. The next morning, Paige met Eric at his office. "She broke into my apartment," Paige said, slamming the photos she'd taken of the damage onto his desk. Eric's eyes widened. "Are you sure it was her?" "Who else would it be?" "She's desperate, Eric. And I'm not going to wait around for her to try something worse." Eric ran a hand through his hair. "I'll talk to the lawyer, see if we can get an emergency restraining order." Paige's patience snapped. "A restraining order isn't going to stop her. We need to find out what she's planning and shut it down. For good." Eric hesitated, but Paige saw the fear in his eyes. He knew she was right. That evening, Paige and Eric combed through everything they had on Vanessa, looking for anything they might have missed. Bank statements, emails, and voice recordings were laid out on the table, but nothing pointed to her next move. Frustrated, Paige leaned back. "She's too careful, she's always one step ahead." Eric stared at his laptop, his expression hardening. "Not always." Paige looked over his shoulder and saw what he'd found. An email Vanessa had sent to a real estate investor just days before the court ruling detailed plans for a new project, funded under a shell company that Paige hadn't seen before. "She's still moving money," Eric said. "She's trying to keep this going even after everything that's happened." Paige's stomach sank. What if the break-in wasn't just about covering her tracks? What if she's setting up something bigger? The next day, Paige confronted Vanessa directly. Vanessa was leaving her attorney's office when Paige stepped out of her car, cutting off her path. "We need to talk," Paige said. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "You're awfully brave, considering how this is going to end for you." "No, Vanessa, this ends for you." Vanessa laughed, but it was hollow. "You think you've won? You've ruined my reputation, destroyed my business. But you haven't won. I still have leverage." Paige's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You think Eric told you everything? Think again. There are things he hasn't admitted, things that could destroy you too." Paige didn't flinch. "You can't scare me." Vanessa smirked. "Then you're even dumber than I thought." Paige didn't let Vanessa see how much those words rattled her. She turned and walked away, but Vanessa's voice followed her. "Watch your back, Paige." Back at Natalie's house, Paige replayed the confrontation in her mind, her nerves on edge. "What if she's telling the truth?" Paige asked. Natalie handed her a glass of wine. "Or what if she's bluffing because she knows she's cornered?" Paige shook her head. "I can't take that chance." Her phone buzzed. It was Eric. "You need to get down here," he said. "Now." When Paige arrived at Eric's office, she found him pacing, his phone pressed to his ear. "What's going on?" she asked. Eric hung up. "Vanessa's gone." Paige's breath caught. "Gone?" "She didn't show up to her hearing this morning. Her lawyer doesn't know where she is." Panic gripped Paige. "What if she comes after us?" Eric looked just as shaken. "We need to find her first." Paige's instincts took her back to the investor Vanessa had contacted. She and Eric drove to the man's office, only to find out that he hadn't spoken to Vanessa in weeks. "She's cutting ties," Eric said as they left. Trying to disappear." Paige shook her head. "No, she's too arrogant for that. She's planning something." The final showdown came later that night, when Paige got a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the construction site. Come alone, or you'll regret it." Paige showed it to Eric. "You're not going alone," he said. "I don't have a choice." Eric grabbed his keys. "Then we go together." The site was dark and deserted, half-finished structures looming like skeletons against the night sky. Paige's heart pounded as she stepped inside, Eric close behind. Vanessa emerged from the shadows, her eyes wild. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" "You broke into my apartment," Paige said, her voice steady. "And now you're running out of options." Vanessa laughed, but there was desperation behind it. "You don't get it, do you? I don't lose." Eric stepped forward. "You already have." Vanessa pulled out her phone. "Not yet. I still have proof. Emails, contracts, everything. You think I'm going down alone. Think again." Paige called her bluff. "Then do it. Expose Eric. Expose me, but it won't save you." Vanessa hesitated, her confidence wavering. Before she could react, police lights lit up the site. Paige had already tipped them off. Vanessa turned to run, but officers closed in, cuffing her as she screamed. "You'll regret this." Paige didn't flinch this time. She just watched, as Vanessa was hauled away, her threats fading into the night. The next morning, Paige stood in her empty apartment, sunlight streaming through the windows. It was over. She wasn't the same woman who had once doubted her strength. She'd faced betrayal, fear, and manipulation, and she'd come out stronger. As she closed the last box and carried it out the door, Paige smiled. A new beginning. Let us know your thoughts about Paige's story in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Paige paced her apartment, the adrenaline from the night before still thrumming through her veins. Vanessa was gone, arrested, humiliated, and out of their lives for good. But the tension lingered, like the aftermath of a storm that had uprooted everything in its path. Eric called twice that morning, but Paige let it go to voicemail. She needed space. The fight might have been over, but the wounds it left behind were still raw. By mid-afternoon, Natalie showed up with coffee and pastries, acting as if nothing had happened. "So," Natalie said, sinking into the couch, "how does it feel to be the woman who took down Vanessa Hunt?" Paige laughed, but it came out hollow. "It doesn't feel real yet." "Of course it doesn't," Natalie said, brushing crumbs off her lap. "Because you haven't let yourself breathe. The storm's over, Paige. It's time to let it go." Paige stared out the window. "It's not that easy." "Why not?" Natalie pressed. "She's in jail. Eric's trying to put his life back together. And you get to move on." Paige exhaled slowly. "I don't even know what moving on looks like anymore." Natalie set her coffee down and leaned forward. "Then figure it out. And while you're at it, figure out what you're going to do about Eric." Paige flinched. She'd been avoiding that question for weeks, burying herself in the chaos to keep from dealing with the mess of emotions left in its wake. "I don't think there's anything left to do," Paige admitted. Natalie gave her a pointed look. "You don't believe that if you did, you wouldn't still be answering his calls." Paige didn't answer. Later that evening, Eric showed up at her door. Paige hesitated before letting him in, but the look on his face told her this wasn't just another attempt to apologize. "What's wrong?" Eric stepped inside, running a hand through his hair. "It's Vanessa. She's out on bail." Paige froze. "What?" "She posted bail this morning. I thought you should know." Paige's heart raced. "You think she's going to come after us again?" "I don't know," Eric admitted. "But I don't trust her to let this go." Paige clenched her fists. She'd thought the nightmare was finally over, but it wasn't. "Then we end this. For good." Eric looked at her, surprised by the determination in her voice. "What are you thinking?" Paige grabbed her coat. "I'm thinking we make sure she can't hurt us again." Paige and Eric tracked Vanessa to a luxury hotel just outside the city. "She's not even trying to lay low," Eric said as they watched her car pull into the lot. Paige's stomach churned. "Of course not. She's too arrogant for that." They waited until Vanessa disappeared inside before following her, keeping their distance as they trailed her to the hotel bar. Vanessa was seated in a corner booth, sipping a martini and scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. Paige approached first, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Vanessa glanced up and smirked. Well, look who decided to come visit." Paige didn't bother sitting down. "You need to stop." Vanessa leaned back, swirling her drink. "Stop what, living my life? You're out on bail, Vanessa. That doesn't mean you're free." Vanessa's smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered. "You can't touch me, Paige. Not anymore." Paige leaned closer, her voice steady. "You don't scare me. And I promise you, if you come after me or Eric again, I'll make sure you end up right back in that cell. And this time, you won't get out." Vanessa's eyes darkened. "You think you're so untouchable? You think one little courtroom win makes you safe?" Paige didn't flinch. "I know it does." Eric stepped up beside her, his presence solid and unyielding. "And so do the police. They're watching you, Vanessa. So if you're smart, you'll leave and never come back." For the first time, Vanessa looked genuinely rattled. She opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again, snapping her purse shut and standing. "You haven't seen the last of me," she hissed before storming out. Paige exhaled, her body trembling as the weight of the confrontation sank in. Eric touched her arm. "You okay?" Paige nodded, though her heart was still pounding. "I will be." The next morning, Paige woke up to a text from her lawyer. Vanessa was arrested again, this time for violating her bail conditions. Relief flooded through Paige, but it was mixed with exhaustion. The fight was finally over, but it had taken everything out of her. Eric called later that afternoon. "It's done," he said. "She's not coming back from this." Paige closed her eyes and let the words sink in. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For standing by me through all of this." Eric hesitated. "I know I hurt you, Paige, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope, someday, you'll see how much I've changed." Paige didn't respond right away. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, that day wasn't impossible. Paige spent the next few weeks rebuilding her life, this time with no loose ends. She cut ties with the past and focused on the future, starting with a fresh slate. Natalie helped her redecorate the apartment, turning it into a space that felt entirely her own. Eric gave her space but checked in occasionally, and while their relationship was far from healed, Paige knew they were both in a better place. As for Vanessa, her story faded into the background, replaced by new scandals and headlines. But Paige never forgot what she'd been through, or how far she'd come. She wasn't the same woman who had walked blindly into betrayal. She was stronger, smarter, and ready for whatever came next. What do you think about Paige's journey? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Paige stood outside the courthouse, her breath fogging in the cold morning air. It had been a week since Vanessa's second arrest, but the tension hadn't lifted. Not yet. Eric stepped up beside her, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "You don't have to be here," he said softly. "Yes, I do," Paige replied, eyes fixed on the courthouse steps. "I need to see this through." Vanessa's hearing was scheduled for that morning. Her charges had escalated: blackmail, fraud, and now violating her bail. Paige wanted to believe it was finally over, but a nagging voice in the back of her mind warned her to stay guarded. When Vanessa finally arrived, flanked by 2 officers, Paige felt her stomach twist. Even in cuffs, Vanessa managed to look put together, her chin held high as if this were just another business meeting. "She still thinks she's untouchable," Paige muttered. Eric leaned in. Not for long. Inside the courtroom, Vanessa's lawyer made one last attempt to paint her as the victim of a personal vendetta. He claimed Paige and Eric had conspired to ruin her reputation out of jealousy and bitterness. Paige's blood boiled, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd already learned that Vanessa thrived on rattling her. Mia, their lawyer, stood and calmly dismantled the defense. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said, holding up the stack of emails, texts, and recordings. "Ms. Hunt manipulated, blackmailed, and threatened my clients. This wasn't revenge. It was survival." Vanessa's facade cracked. She shifted nervously in her seat as the judge reviewed the evidence, and then came the moment Paige had been waiting for. In light of the overwhelming evidence, bail is revoked, and Ms. Hunt will remain in custody until her trial. Paige exhaled, the weight she'd been carrying finally lifting. She turned to Eric, who let out a shaky breath of his own. "It's done," he said, almost in disbelief. Paige didn't answer. Instead, she watched as Vanessa was led away, her mask of confidence completely shattered. Later that night, Paige sat on her balcony, staring out at the city lights. She should have felt victorious, but instead, all she felt was drained. Natalie called, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Did you hear the news?" Paige smiled faintly. "It's kind of hard to miss." "Good. Now you can finally move on." "Yeah," Paige said, but her voice lacked conviction. Natalie picked up on it immediately. "What's wrong?" Paige hesitated. "It's just, everything's changed. I'm not the same person I was before this." "That's not a bad thing," Natalie said. "You're stronger now. Don't forget that." Paige hung up and let the words sink in. Stronger. Maybe. But what came next? 2 days later, Eric showed up at her door. "Are you avoiding me?" he asked. Paige stepped aside to let him in. "No, I just needed time to think." Eric looked around her apartment, his eyes lingering on the boxes still packed from her move. "This place doesn't feel like you," he said. "It's not supposed to," Paige replied. "It's supposed to be new." Eric nodded. "I get it. I've been doing a lot of thinking too." Paige crossed her arms. "And?" Eric took a deep breath. "I want to make things right. Not just with you, but with myself. I've been going to therapy, working through everything that led me to what I did." Paige studied him carefully. He looked different, less polished, more vulnerable. "And what have you figured out?" "That I screwed up," Eric admitted. "I let my insecurities and ambition get the best of me, and I took you for granted. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know." Paige's chest tightened. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let herself fall back into the comfort of what they used to have, but another part of her wasn't sure she could trust him again. "I appreciate you telling me that," she said. "But I don't know if I'm ready for more than this." Eric's shoulders sagged, but he nodded. I understand, just don't shut me out completely, okay? Paige gave him a small smile. We'll see. Paige threw herself into work, determined to keep moving forward. She volunteered more at the shelter, and even started taking business classes, inspired by the chaos she'd survived. But Eric kept reaching out, showing up at coffee shops, and asking her to dinner. At first, she resisted, afraid to let him back in. But little by little, he started to prove himself. One night, after another long shift, Paige found herself texting him first. Paige, dinner tomorrow. Eric, I thought you'd never ask. The final chapter came 6 months later. Paige stood in the courtroom again, this time for Vanessa's sentencing. The judge handed down a 5-year prison sentence, and Paige finally felt the closure she'd been waiting for. Eric squeezed her hand as they walked out. It's over, he said. Paige smiled. For good this time. In the weeks that followed, Paige and Eric took things slow, rebuilding trust one day at a time. Paige kept her apartment, but let Eric help her repaint and redecorate, turning it into a space that reflected her new beginning. And as she hung the last picture on the wall, she realized she wasn't the same woman who had walked away from her marriage. She was stronger, smarter, and more certain of what she deserved. If you've been following Paige's journey, let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Paige's footsteps echoed in the dimly lit hallway of the courthouse, her heart pounding in rhythm with each step. She told herself, this was the final chapter, the last hurdle before she could close the door on this nightmare. But deep down, the unease lingered. Vanessa's sentencing was supposed to bring closure, yet Paige couldn't shake the feeling that there was one last twist waiting to reveal itself. Eric walked beside her, his face calm, but his hands clenched tightly at his sides. Are you sure you want to be here for this? He asked. Paige didn't hesitate. I have to be. Inside the courtroom, Vanessa sat at the defense table, her hair and makeup still perfect, despite the prison-issued jumpsuit. She looked like a woman who refused to acknowledge the reality of her situation. Paige settled into her seat, locking eyes with Vanessa for just a moment. There was no fear this time, only resolve. The hearing dragged on as the judge reviewed the charges: fraud, blackmail, and multiple violations of restraining orders. The evidence was damning, and Vanessa's lawyer offered only hollow defenses, each one more desperate than the last. But then, Vanessa did something no one expected. She stood, ignoring her lawyer's protests. I'd like to make a statement, she said, her voice steady. The judge hesitated but nodded. Proceed. Vanessa turned, her eyes locking onto Paige. I made mistakes, she began, but I'm not the only one to blame for how this all happened. Paige's breath caught, but she forced herself to stay calm. Vanessa's lips curled into the faintest smirk. Eric isn't as innocent as he wants you to believe. Ask him what really happened with the Whitman deal. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, and Eric stiffened beside Paige. What is she talking about? Paige whispered. Eric didn't answer. Vanessa continued. You think he was the victim, the faithful husband betrayed by me? Think again. He wasn't just working late, Paige. He was stealing, fudging numbers to make himself look good. And I was the one who kept the secrets. Paige's stomach dropped. That's enough, the judge said, cutting Vanessa off. But the damage was done. Outside the courthouse, Paige confronted Eric. Tell me it's not true. Eric hesitated, just long enough for her to know the truth before he even spoke. It's complicated, he said. No, Paige snapped. It's simple. Either she's lying, or you are. Eric ran a hand through his hair. I didn't steal anything, I just adjusted projections. Everyone does it. Paige's hands shook. You lied to me after everything we've been through. You still couldn't tell me the truth? I was protecting you, Eric said. No. Paige stepped back. You were protecting yourself. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I stood by you. I fought for you. And you were lying to me the whole time. Eric reached for her, but she pulled away. I can't do this, she said, her voice breaking. Not again. That night, Paige sat alone in her apartment, replaying everything Vanessa had said. Natalie showed up, her face full of concern. Are you okay? Paige let out a shaky laugh. Not even close. Natalie sat beside her. Do you believe her? Paige looked down at her hands. I don't know. But the fact that I even have to ask says everything, doesn't it? Natalie didn't try to sugarcoat it. You need answers. Paige, real ones. And if Eric can't give them to you, then maybe it's time to move on. Paige nodded, but deep down, she knew moving on was easier said than done. The next day, Paige demanded answers. She showed up at Eric's office unannounced, catching him off guard. We need to talk, she said. Eric closed the door and gestured for her to sit, but Paige remained standing. Tell me the truth, she said. All of it. Eric sighed and leaned against his desk. Fine. The Whitman deal wasn't as clean as I made it out to be. I manipulated some numbers to push it through faster, but it wasn't illegal. Paige's eyes narrowed. And Vanessa knew? She found out after the fact and used it against me, Eric admitted. But I swear I was trying to fix it before it blew up. Paige's voice shook. You let me think I was crazy? You let me fight for you, defend you, and you never once told me the truth? I was scared, Eric said. Scared of losing you. Scared of what would happen if it all came out. Paige felt the weight of his words, but it didn't ease the ache in her chest. This isn't just about Vanessa, she said. It's about us, about trust, and I don't think I can trust you anymore. Eric's face fell. Paige, no, she said firmly. I deserve better than this. Paige filed for divorce the next week. Eric fought it at first, but eventually he let her go, admitting that he'd made too many mistakes to fix what they had. Paige focused on rebuilding her life, pouring herself into work, and surrounding herself with friends who reminded her of her worth. Vanessa's sentencing made headlines, but Paige refused to let it define her story. She wasn't a victim. She was a survivor. And while the scars of betrayal lingered, they no longer controlled her. 6 months later, Paige stood in her newly renovated apartment, surrounded by friends as they celebrated her fresh start. Natalie raised a glass. To Paige, the strongest woman I know. Laughter and applause filled the room, and for the first time in months, Paige felt free. She caught her reflection in the window and barely recognized the woman staring back. This version of her wasn't afraid of the unknown. She welcomed it. If you're still watching, let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Paige stood in her apartment, the soft glow of the evening light spilling through the windows. The space felt different now, not just because of the new furniture or the fresh coat of paint, but because of her. She had changed. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined standing here, completely on her own, and feeling at peace. But now she breathed easier. She had fought through betrayal, deceit, and heartbreak, and come out the other side stronger. Natalie knocked on the door, letting herself in before Paige could answer. I brought wine, she announced, holding up a bottle and 2 glasses. Paige laughed, grateful for her best friend's unrelenting support. What are we celebrating this time? Your divorce papers finally went through, Natalie said with a grin. Officially single, and officially thriving. Paige poured the wine, her smile growing. I'll drink to that. They clinked glasses and settled onto the couch. So, Natalie said, sipping her drink, what's next? Paige shrugged. But for the first time, it wasn't out of uncertainty. It was out of possibility. I'm focusing on work for now. The shelter offered me a bigger role in their outreach programs, and I'm thinking about starting my own business on the side. Something that helps other women rebuild, just like I did. Natalie beamed. That's perfect for you. Turning all this mess into something positive. Paige nodded. I don't want what happened to define me. I want it to fuel me. A week later, Paige received an email from Eric. It was short and to the point, a final apology, and a thank you for the time they shared. She stared at it for a long time before replying. Paige, I hope you find peace, Eric. Take care. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was closure, and that was enough. Vanessa's trial ended with a 5-year prison sentence, and her name slowly faded from the headlines. Paige didn't waste time following updates. She had already spent too much energy giving Vanessa power over her life. Instead, Paige poured herself into her new role at the shelter, mentoring women who were starting over after abusive relationships and personal betrayals. She recognized the fear in their eyes, the same fear she'd once felt, but she also saw their strength. One afternoon, A young woman named Alyssa sat across from Paige, nervously twisting a bracelet on her wrist. "I don't think I can do this," Alyssa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Paige leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "That's what I thought too. But you can. You're stronger than you think. You just have to take it one step at a time." Alyssa looked up, searching Paige's face for reassurance. "And what if I fail?" "Then you try again," Paige said. "You don't let anyone, not even yourself, tell you that you can't." The words hung in the air, and Paige realized she wasn't just talking to Alyssa. She was reminding herself too. By the time Paige's business launched 6 months later, it was already making waves in the community. She called it Foundations, a name that symbolized rebuilding from the ground up. With Natalie as her unofficial partner and cheerleader, Paige hosted workshops, fundraisers, and mentoring sessions. She used her own story as a way to connect with others, proving that it was possible to rise after falling. At one of the events, Eric showed up. Paige spotted him near the entrance, looking out of place in his tailored suit. He waited until the crowd thinned before approaching her. "This is amazing," he said, gesturing to the packed room. "You really did it." Paige smiled, but it didn't hurt any more to see him. "Thank you." Eric hesitated. "I'm proud of you, Paige, and I'm sorry for everything." She met his eyes, this time without anger or regret. "I know." They talked for a few minutes before Eric excused himself. As he walked away, Paige felt nothing but relief, no longing, no sadness, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd made the right choice. Later that night, Paige returned home and sat on her balcony, looking out at the city she'd once felt so lost in. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment, the lies, the betrayals, the heartbreak. And yet, none of it defined her anymore. She had taken the pieces of her broken life and built something stronger. Paige picked up her phone and opened the calendar. Tomorrow, she had another workshop to lead. Another chance to help someone else take their first step toward freedom. And for the first time in a long time, she couldn't wait. So, what did you think about Paige's journey? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.